I would be delighted and honored. Lisa Bates is a professor of urban studies and planning at Portland State University. She has been a tireless worker for equity and planning and has assisted the city of Portland in innovations such as an Office of Equity. She's also been notable in the area of academic planning and promoting equity planning, which we in Cleveland know from the legacy of Norm Krumholtz. Right. And she has done important work on what she's going to talk about, which is revisiting the harm done by urban renewal, particularly to minority communities, including that in Portland.
With no further ado, Lisa, live from wherever you are in Pennsylvania, I guess somewhere, we'll have you present your speech. Is affirmatively repairing the harm community preference in Portland's Interstate Corridor urban renewal area. Take it away.
Let me get my screen sharing set up here. Always takes a moment.
Well, you're set to go.
All right. Thanks everyone for having me. It's so nice to connect with folks in Cleveland. You may know that I am a huge fan of Norm Krumholtz, and also that Portland has a connection to Norm Krumholtz and the Cleveland story of equity planning via Ernie Bonner, who was Portland's first chief planner. And I'll mention a little bit about some of the work that Ernie did in our city to try to advance equity. A lot of what I've been thinking about and working on in Portland is about how our past is still in the present, our past of urban renewal, both in terms of the physical damage to our city's fabric and infrastructure, and also to the kind of damage in communities that Dr. Mindy Fullylove has termed root shock. So this kind of emotional and community connectivity that has been destroyed and damaged by displacement. And what do we actually do about that now, and particularly in a context of fair housing and housing policy? How can we work on that? And certainly that Krumholtz equity planning lens, asking how can we bring the most benefit to the people who have the least, has been a really powerful question for us to ask. What are we going to do about that? So I want to say a little bit about the backstory of Portland, the history and context that we're in, and then speak to the ways that equity planning and the idea of repair for urban renewal are promoting change really at very concrete possibilities at the housing policy scale, but also in how we are revisioning, planning, and urban space, in particular in Northeast Portland. So I know that, I'm not from Portland, and I know that the folks in Cleveland, you might think, oh, what the heck does Portland have to do with us? It's a very different place. The images that we have of Portland and the cute twee coffee shops and hipsters and whiteness, frankly, they are real. But we also have many parts of our history in Portland that are not at all different from any other city. A history of redlining and exclusion, a history of highly racialized urban planning practices, and an urban renewal era that was as happening as it was anywhere else. And I think that our culture of planning and our interest and our articulation of equity goals can be a model that other cities can look to as possibilities to repair very direct harms. So yes, Portland, we have this national understanding that Portland has a particular kind of culture. We do have, a very special thing in our regional metro government. But again, in a short backstory of Portland, the African-American community of Portland really arrived during World War II to work in the shipyards. And immediately upon this, tens of thousands of Black families coming to be war workers, the city was primed and ready for containment and exclusion. These are headlines very typical of the time from the Oregonian newspaper. And the Black population was kind of pushed into previously red line neighborhoods. The city used deed restrictions in most neighborhoods to prevent Blacks from being able to buy property. Realtors and the sort of city fathers of the time, the city council and mayor, made formalized agreements about steering in which neighborhoods Black families would be allowed to live in. And the Portland Development Commission, our urban renewal agency, was incredibly aggressive in its use of urban renewal. So you would think that in a city with just about a 6% Black population, it might be possible to build a highway that doesn't cut through those communities. That was not true. So just like everywhere else, Portland began to enact a Robert Moses designed highway plan. Later, actually, with Ernie's leadership, later on, part of the freeway expansion was actually stopped in Portland, and Portland became famous for stopping the Moses Freeway when it went through white working class neighborhoods. But here, through Black neighborhoods, there was complete demolition, convention center, sports coliseum, and sort of creating these moats of parking around institutions like Legacy Emmanuel Hospital, and other kind of what were intended to be kind of anchoring economic institutions like shopping malls. I think these kinds of images and that concept would be very familiar to everyone there in Cleveland as to how the typical practice of planning went forward. The sort of co-definitions of blight and minority populations were the justification for these activities that ripped out in large part the heart of the Black community, which continued to be moved through this area called the ALBINA district. Folks in the community were very aware of what was happening. There was a lot of activity, a lot of activism pushing back. And you see, this is actually response and resistance from 1970. So the Portland Development Commission continued to practice large-scale demolitions into the early 1970s in Portland's Black communities. Residents pointed out, every time that you draw a boundary, you push blight further, you create uncertainty, you make it impossible for us to get loans. That PDC is what's actually depreciating our community, and is what is creating and continually expanding ghettoized Portland. And again, Black folks still couldn't really move to other parts of the city because of this kind of steering and continued redlining. So Ernie Bonner came from Cleveland in the late 1970s to Portland, and in his writings and in his plannings, he is very hopeful about the possibilities of regionalism, about the possibilities for having fair share housing agreements, for creating balance and desegregating the city, making housing choice available for folks. But this really deep logic, particularly in the Portland Development Commission, was far more powerful than the plans that were being made with the best of intentions. Also assisted by continued redlining by private sector lenders. And in the early 1990s, the Oregonian had a major expose of predatory lending and redlining by mainstream banks in Northeast Portland's Black community. So if you imagine that these are neighborhoods that are majority Black, this is the part of the city, not just the part of the city, but the part of Oregon as a state where the majority of Black folks live, and essentially could not get any kind of home loans, any kind of refinance or repair loans. At this time, folks in the city talked about Northeast Portland as though it would be blighted forever. The belief was that there was really almost no way to deal with the physical disrepair that was caused by this extensive long-term redlining. Absentee ownership, and there was an ill-conceived school busing plan. There was intense police corruption episode, including drugs and vice, and allowing major gang activity to form. So kind of all of this formation and reproduction or recreation of what is termed a ghetto was happening through neglect, through poor choices, and through activities in both the private and public sector. And again, I think these are stories that we don't often talk about in Portland on the national scene. We tend to skip forward to our current environment, but they are the same logics of urban planning and the same activities of urban renewal and the same damage that was done to communities as happened in most cities in the United States. So in facing this recognition of redlining, of decline, the Portland Development Commission kind of charged in with its only tool, urban renewal. There was another urban renewal designation in 2000 to create a tax increment financing district, a TIF district, to fund a light rail expansion, Hope 6 public housing redevelopments, and it went along with very intense code enforcement. That intense code enforcement ended up being quite harmful to the homeowners that did live in the district, who were still unable to get financing to fix up their homes. And the rezonings and the infusion of private capital have led to a very rapid gentrification. So as we came from the 1990s into the 2000s, Portland's Black population was pushed out, essentially being dispersed out of these kind of darker brown areas, the ALBINA district, into outer East Portland and into the suburbs. There was very little anticipation of gentrification. In some ways, the influx of folks from the Northeast, from the Midwest into Portland just wasn't expected by folks in Portland. And they had no imagination that someone moving from a Milwaukee, a Cleveland, a Philadelphia would look at Portland neighborhoods and say, yeah, I want to live there. They had no sense that these were, bad neighborhoods or the ghetto. There's beautiful bungalows, Victorian homes, old trees, parks, sidewalks. It's the classic rent gap theory. The property had been devalued, but the potential was very high, and people stepped in to enjoy that potential. It's also really important to note that this movement of Black families, while people did move to the suburbs, it was nothing like a context that we would call a move to opportunity. The destination neighborhoods for Black folks, particularly lower income Black folks in Portland, are very ill served by infrastructure and by the public sector. They tend to have very little physical transportation connection to the rest of the city. Many of their neighborhoods, in fact, do not even have improved paved roads. They're food deserts, and they're areas of limited sort of job access. So, and frankly, because they are communities of white flight of previous generations, many of those destination neighborhoods were extremely hostile to influxes of Black folks, as well as immigrants who are moving there now. So there's a lot of complaints about school system, policing, and just community relations in general in these neighborhoods. In Northeast Portland, there's really a kind of a looming erasure from the neighborhood, but again, a tremendous amount of grassroots resistance. People were, fighting to maintain the presence of community institutions, places like the Urban League, Black churches and businesses, some long-term Black homeowners who still live in the communities, and the only majority Black high school in the city, that were all still in Northeast Portland. And as the Portland Development Commission continued its practices of providing sort of subsidy and land to market rate activities, this picture on the left of this march and protest was at a space in which a Trader Joe's was going to be subsidized by Portland Development Commission. that kind of one more project that Trader Joe's was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for the community, and led to a kind of a reckoning with the city of Portland around its commitment to equity. That the city of Portland had said, we're going to have an equity planning approach, we're going to lead with racial equity, and we're going to recognize Black community. But yet here you go again, kind of doing economic development with no thought about displacement, no thought about inclusion for folks who have lived in the community for a long time. So resulting from a pretty intense struggle between community and the city has been this program to really make this commitment real at all scales, and to think about how do we actually repair and restore community after urban renewal, but also taking care to think about how that fits into fair housing, right? Because folks here know under fair housing, you even acknowledging that we have done harm to a group based on their protected class status as race and ethnicity. We can't really target programs by race and ethnicity, even though they're in sort of direct response. So it takes a little bit of thinking to get to how do we actually do something about this harm that's been created, and kind of thread the needle of fair housing law and create a program that makes sense. So the Northeast housing strategy is that strategy for the city of Portland. Because gentrification in Northeast Portland's urban renewal area, and yes, we still call it an urban renewal area, even though that term has a lot of bad associations, we still use that term in Portland. Because the market-led revitalization was so successful, the amount of tax increment finance bond capacity has increased much faster than the city expected. So there was sort of extra money, if you will, which was all moved, again, with community pressure into affordable housing. No more economic development activities. That all of the work now has to be on anti-displacement. The one really critical piece of trying to establish and reestablish trust with the city's ability to govern this kind of a program and this new approach was that the city formally acknowledged that its use of urban renewal areas had been damaging, that it had been racist, and that in some key instances had actually skirted the law in the way that properties were condemned and taken by eminent domain. And so there was at the outset a very clear acknowledgement that that had happened. And then again, within the context of fair housing, trying to work to develop a policy that would allow for prioritization of resources to go to folks who had experienced that harm over multiple generations. That process took place within the context of a community advisory committee with a number of longstanding leaders, people who had long community and family ties, as well as housing experts, to work through and develop how could we create a policy to provide a community preference policy for an area. This is the first place-based, large-scale place-based preference policy in the country that's now being looked at by other communities. So the way that, I'll get a little wonky for a moment because I think y'all can handle it. The way the Portland housing preference policy works is it provides people with points on a priority list. So this multicolored map here shows the history of urban renewal districts in Portland, Northeast Portland, from 1957 to 2000. And people get points on the list depending on where they've lived. And so if you've lived in areas with the most overlapping urban renewal area, you get the most points. You also get additional points when you can show yourself, your parents' generation, and your grandparents' generation. So it's explicitly acknowledging a multi-generational impacts of root shock and displacement. Again, that community, family, emotional disruption that has happened over multiple generations for Portland's Black community. This policy is both a right to stay and a right to return. In other words, you can still be living in Northeast Portland and use the community preference policy to get access to safe and stable, affordable housing, or you may have moved elsewhere, anywhere in the community or even out of state, if you can show that you have this experience of having lived in Northeast Portland. So again, it's place-based, it's not race-based. And there are certainly non-Black folks, white folks, and other people of color who can obtain housing through the preference policy, because this was never a 100% Black communities. They've always been racially mixed, but majority Black. And the absolute top of the priority list are folks who can demonstrate that their homes were taken through, again, what's now acknowledged to be illegal eminent domain actions, and demolished. And so the city put out a tremendous effort through community organizations, through the library, by hiring folks in the community to create outreach for this, to go throughout the metro area, Metro Portland, to share through social media, through networks, that these opportunities were going to come forward, and to support people to make the application, to figure out how you can prove and demonstrate that you have these ties. So there's arrangements that were made with other institutions in the city around prior address histories, utilities bills, school enrollments. The city also pulled all of its archival documentation. So the city archivists have worked kind of overtime to digitize documentation of takings, for Emmanuel Hospital, for the Coliseum. And so these kind of lists of names and addresses that folks can go to, and support with these maps, to help people to get the maximum amount of priority that they can. At this point, there's been approximately 500 apartment units for folks making below 60% of the area median income that have been created, and 85 new homeownership units. This is, of course, exciting, but I'll just tag that approximately 10,000 Black families were displaced from the urban renewal area from 2000 to 2010, and then another probably 15,000 after that time. So this is an exciting moment, but it's not at the scale of the displacement that has happened. So in my work, I'm working with a colleague to evaluate some of this early implementation, to figure out who's been served by the program, what their motivations were, and how they really experienced returning to these neighborhoods. I think one of our questions has been whether people, now that neighborhoods have gone from 80% Black to 80% white, now that the landscape looks very different, and the commercial districts are upscaled, do people actually enjoy living there? Do they want to come back at all? And once they do they have networks? And what we found was that, in fact, the program is very much serving the demographic of that was living in ALBINA district during the urban renewal era. So I mentioned is probably about 75 to 80% Black, and that is what's mirrored in these in the families that have been able to come back through the program. And that many of the people who are housed in the preference policy did have themselves lived in the neighborhood for most of their own life. People were really motivated by feeling connected to this area. They also knew that having this kind of priority wait list was going to give them a good chance to get into a subsidized stable housing unit, as opposed to being in like a general waiting list pool for the housing authority or a voucher. That this was going to give them an ability to jump up on a priority list. But folks really felt connected to the area. People still have a lot of close family and kinship ties. Interviewing people, talking about their own history and their family history in the neighborhood, how it felt to be back in a familiar part of town, that they might have moved 10 years ago, but they still felt uneasy and not at home in their new communities, and that they really were looking forward to coming back to a part of town that they knew. They also recognized that that there were a lot of material advantages to living in inner Northeast Portland, there's frequent service bus line, there's a light rail, there's beautiful parks, it's close to jobs. All of these wonderful amenities that made it so ripe for gentrification that they were now actually able to take advantage of those now that other parts, other, not so great stuff in the neighborhood have been cleared up, that there aren't vacant and abandoned properties, that there's improvements to environmental quality, that people can go to the neighborhood schools now, they're not being bussed out of the community. So they're actually able to take advantage of that now that there is revitalization. At the same time, there is some tension for folks because they are in a community that's very different. And so there were stories, about a third of the people that we interviewed had stories of feeling excluded or even discriminated against, of feeling like a defensive claim about the neighborhood. You flew here, but I grew here. Wanting their neighbors to know more about the longer history of the community and why they were there. We're coming back. We're not just coming here. And also, there's been some tension around questions of fair housing, that in some places community preference policies have been used to solidify exclusion of people of color, or to entrench segregation. In this context, numerically, that's just not really the case. But also, this is a policy that allows people of color to be integrated into opportunity, to be actually physically in place where there are better amenities and infrastructures for community support. And as some people said, there's really nothing wrong with wanting to be around your people. Being in a community, being an African American community, being connected to church, family, and friend networks is a normal desire, and that shouldn't be understood in the same way as an exclusionary segregation. So the city views this program as really promoting the concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing, that it enables people to remain in a neighborhood that's changing, where otherwise the community of color population will be dropping, but that opportunities are increasing, and that conceptually the idea of preserving community in the face of displacement and root shock is meets the spirit of fair housing, that we want people to have choices and opportunities in all places. I think this also, the experience that people have and the improvement that they describe in their life, their connectivity, both community-wise, but also their ability to get to work, get to school, support their kids' learning and growing and development in programs that they can access, explains a bit more about why programs that simply move people out of their neighborhoods into other suburban environments maybe don't work as well. These are folks who are moving to places that have actual stuff that they can access, but they also have a sense of community. They have a greater sense of familiarity, of control over their environment, and they have the support of friends and family around them. They're not on their own in a move to opportunity type of context where no one else is there to kind of like understand their history and community and be connected to them. So those are some of the these very concrete things that are happening in Portland to support housing opportunities for folks that are directly connected to their urban renewal experience. Again, this policy is really primarily about rental housing for low-income folks. It's been more difficult to support home ownership simply because the property values are so high that it's hard to support home buyers. So the city has turned to trying to build more home ownership units on city-owned land, and there will still be it will be a lift to complete the amount of projects that people had originally envisioned in this proposal. It's probably important to note that the original 2000 Interstate Corridor Urban Renewal Area Plan called for 1,000 units of housing to be created and for all of the existing homeowners in the neighborhood to be stabilized, in these neighborhoods to be stabilized. So this plan will not get to the original 2000 goals of having 1,000 new housing units. And, you know, in large part because the change in the market has just made the development conditions so much more difficult than they would have been had that equity approach of combining economic development and anti-displacement been taken from the beginning of the policy. And so there certainly remains a conversation in the community that says, well, had you done this from the start, we would not have been where we are today. And with that spirit, we're also beginning to talk about larger scale ways to think about repair of urban renewal. Here is a, you know, kind of a small number of families who will access a very important housing opportunity. But what else can we talk about when we think about development and redevelopment as the neighborhoods continue to build out? So one really important and very concrete, tangible piece is that the last eminent domain demolition that happened in Portland in 1972, the lot on which that occurred, the city block, a full city block that was demolished in 1972, remains vacant. So I always show this photo in Portland, this color photo from 1972. This is the removal of the cupola from a commercial building that was, this corner was really the heart of the Black business district that was completely demolished by urban renewal. And when we talk about this in Portland, typically people show a black and white photo of this building from a much earlier era. And as part of this project of beginning the Northeast strategy, the city archive scanned in a number of color photos that demonstrate just how recently this occurred. This is pretty late to be, you know, demolishing with eminent domain. And this is one of the lots that where the buildings, both commercial and residential buildings, were condemned in what was later acknowledged to be an illegal condemnation action that skirted some of the policy rules of the time. The lot was demolished at the behest of Legacy Emmanuel Hospital. They had a plan to essentially create like a moat of parking lots around the hospital to kind of separate it from the neighborhood, and they've never developed the property. It remains a vacant lot. This photo shows it nicely mowed, but it's often been also knee-high grass. So about 3 years ago, the hospital board decided in the midst of this Northeast housing strategy, seeing how the community remained engaged and focused on wanting to reclaim space, they and the Portland Development Commission have begun a legal process to transfer that property back to community use. The Portland Development Commission discovered that there was a clause in their transfer of property to the hospital that it had to be developed within a certain amount of time, which obviously has well elapsed. And so there is now a community advisory committee and a new nonprofit land trust forming that's community led that will develop and redevelop this site. It's a city block, you know, it's a little bit under 2 acres. It is not the biggest and most important development site in the city of Portland right now in terms of its monetary value or its development capacity, but it is one of the most important for community history and the sense that of people kind of reclaiming that space. And that negotiation, the kind of conclusion of that negotiation has been really important for folks in the community to feel like something more concrete is happening. And then even in the bigger picture, to continue to apply our equity planning question, you know, how can we do the most for those who have had the least, has come up in as the city, the state, and community members have been agitating to repair the physical infrastructure around these original urban renewal projects. So here's, showing the demolition on the left, and then aerial view of now. This is the sports stadium area, highway, and various off ramps. You can see that this is not a walkable urban paradise. This is not, this isn't how we like to plan in Portland. It's a lot of concrete. It's a lot of off ramps. The access to the waterfront is completely cut off. And there, as the kind of transportation nerds got a hold of this to say, hey, what could we do to reopen the riverfront? How can we reconnect these different places? A set of community leaders came forward to say, wait a second, we have to do this in an equity way. We can't do this again where we leave it as an afterthought like we did in the urban renewal era. We have to build this in from the beginning. And they've created a vision, the ALBINA vision, to redevelop in ways that will support and promote community participation, community ownership, community-led design that will reference to the area's history as a jazz hotspot, that would reference the era's history as having important Black churches and community organizations that were lost to urban renewal. And they've been very intentional in creating these architectural renderings. You can see, in the foreground here, this is a Black couple. But throughout all of their drawings, they're showing details that make it clear that they want this to be a home that is comfortable and welcoming for all communities. They want to reconnect the waterfront and pay homage not only to the indigenous communities that first settled along the waterfront, the Willamette River, but also to lift up the history of the shipbuilders and the shipyard workers who worked on the waterfront. Which includes, Black folks who came from the South, but also Native folks from throughout Oregon, and Asian workers who came up from California, many of whom found a very hostile climate here. But to create new places and placemaking with a vision that includes Black, Indigenous, low-income folks from the beginning with real material benefits. I see this as very much in the spirit of the equity planning, mantra, again, to ask always, how can this work that we want to do? We want to do the work to reconnect the street grid and develop an area of our city that has been underused for a long period of time. But how do we do that in a way that benefits the people who have been the least benefited in the past? How do we do it in a way that doesn't increase burdens? And this area actually is a very, very major redevelopment site. And so the advocacy, the planning, and the work that's being done by the ALBINA Vision folks is really critical for one of the few remaining places in the city of Portland that has the opportunity to do this scale of redevelopment. This is all super exciting, and it's 2020 now, and in some ways we're really harkening back to we're not discovering, but we're rediscovering equity planning. I went back into the 1980 comprehensive plan that Ernie Bonner led, having come from Cleveland, wanting very much to create and see a balanced city and a balanced metro area that had opportunity for all. Some of these policy proposals, that folks here were fighting for just a few years ago, and here they were in the 1980 comp plan all along to, expand opportunities for residents in neighborhoods that were underserved, to discourage involuntary displacement, to allow for housing choice across the city and across the region. So we're in many ways, we're rediscovering our own history here in Portland, and we're trying to take and create opportunities to build not only a city that is cool and hip, but also a city that's just and that supports Black life and supports people of color's lives to be empowered and to thrive in communities everywhere. So I will stop there and we can open conversation.
Any question and answers, Chip?
Yeah, let me look here. So here's one. This is a neighborhood that I've been working in, Buckeye Woodland neighborhood. They applied for a 3% loan, and they couldn't get it. This is a persistent problem where we have programs that county and the city does, and they're linked to the public dollars, and it's always dealing with home repair. I mean, it's the roof, the gutters, stuff like that. Have you found with existing homeowners where they are, that issue of home repair loans?
The issue, I'm just looking in the chat here. So the issue of sort of not being able to
Gain access.
not being able to get the subsidized loans.
Right.
So I think part of what this Northeast strategy has really demanded that the city do was to look at all of their programming in the urban renewal area and ask, is this actually serving people? And to start to shift some of their activities, and actually to one of the things that has happened is some of the loan programs for home repair have shifted into grant programs, and they've put some lenses in terms of long-term residency and income limits to try to lift up those longest term homeowners who have the least access to capital, to loans, to make sure that they have grants and sort of coordinate those with nonprofit partners as well, and so that people can preserve their homes. Actually, one of our big issues that's very unsolved, and I would love to know how you all solve it, has to do with intergenerational transfer of those homes. So thinking about how, if the city has supported, an older homeowner with a significant grant and a loan, how to help support them and their family to make sure that they retain, not that they're required to live there for forever and ever and ever for multiple generations, but that if there is a sale, making sure that that happens in a scrupulous, legitimate way so that actual intergenerational wealth is passed down. Making sure that people don't get kind of conned by predatory lenders and predatory realtors, to make sure that these kind of precious few owned homes do continue to benefit the families, especially when there's been a lot of repair money put into them.
We just did a forum just before our conference on LLCs, and the systemic problem in Cleveland has been finding mortgages for less than $50,000, and there's kind of swooping in not only in city neighborhoods in Cleveland, but in kind of first ring suburbs where people are bulk buying. A neighborhood in Cleveland called Old Brooklyn, and there's some streets where 40% are LLCs, and we need to do a better job on focusing on that. And I think our real challenge is just having equity home improvement loans. I mean, the roof fell down, or the porch is falling down, or the home, we call it the challenge fund here in Cleveland. And we need to expand that out to more than just the city of Cleveland Heights, but to South Euclid and Garfield Heights and Maple Heights and east side of Cleveland. And I agree with you. I mean, this is a huge issue. I mean, people swoop down into a neighborhood, and there's point of sale inspection. That's one thing that Cleveland Heights has tried to deal with. But how you get intergenerational wealth, which has been such a tradition in the white community, I mean, that's how they got rich. So, okay, let's go to the chat here. Dennis, you had a question. Go ahead with your question.
My question is about the larger context of what Portland is doing. Affirmative action was on the ballot in California this last election. Donald Trump leading the charge against the Black Lives Movement, trying to frighten suburban housewives against who moving to the neighborhood. I'm wondering, Well, Portland may be a rather liberal example, so I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, there probably hasn't been backlash against the program you're talking about, or very much. But in other cities, if we had programs like this, including, there's now discussion of reparations for slavery in Washington, D.C. and other places, how would you see overcoming a likely white backlash, not altogether, maybe by generation or age or region? But I assume that can be and will be a problem, but maybe not in Portland in this particular case.
Well, I think yeah, so there's a lot of Portlands. You know, there's National News Liberal Portland, and then there's a long-standing history of white nationalist organizing, as well as just like regular white racism in Portland and Oregon, especially outside of this central city and part of Portland, where there were sort of those white suburbs of white flight. So I would say on a very micro scale, actually, it's not that the policy has received backlash, but people who have moved into these buildings have absolutely described experiencing backlash in the neighborhood. So it's like arguments over parking that turn into racialized conflicts, or sort of beef around yeah, like just sidewalk behaviors, stores that they feel like they can't go in. So there are conversations about what does it mean then to really integrate the community. How does the neighborhood association board, you know, begin to accept that folks are coming into the neighborhood, and that for those people who are moving into these units, they feel a total claim of ownership over the neighborhood. They absolutely feel like they should be on the neighborhood association board, and they should be involved in everything, because this is their home. This is where their family has lived, even if they haven't personally been there for the past few years. So there's a lot of like micro work that has to get done on that level of segregation. Particularly like as people, most of the subsidized housing is apartment buildings, and then most of the white homers live in a single family home. So there's even kind of a structural stigma that happens. So there's that happening on a micro level, even though no one has really vocally been opposed to the policy. I think in the bigger context of the city, what's been really important is that for like dampening a racial backlash has been to spatialize the conversation, so that the part of town that I was describing that's very underserved by infrastructure, that is actually was totally white until quite recently, and now is kind of a destination for different immigrants of color, although also Russian and Eastern European immigrants, and then Black folks who are displaced, is to say, hey, like also part of affirmatively furthering fair housing is to lift up with community development, with physical development, those other places. And we're also going to try to do that in a way that we don't repeat what happened in Northeast Portland. We're going to build in the equity up front, so that there's kind of contextually targeted spatial plans for equitable distribution of stuff, according to the context of the places that people are living at.
Okay, well, let's see here. So one person had a question about, you know, when I remember Norm Krumholtz's lecture on this, they tore down literally 65,000 homes on the west side of Cleveland to build a freeway. So everybody got vacuumed outside to the suburbs. Is there any discussion about when these suburban communities have benefited from this, that they should be participating in the equity planning and some cash back into the city of Portland?
Oh, so now if you want to talk about the backlash, here's where the backlash might come in. One of the dreams of the 1980 comp plan, Ernie Bonner, was that part of our regional governance would include a fair share housing, and would include that kind of like cross-border sharing of responsibility. one of the outcomes of those conversations was that the suburban jurisdictions of Portland went down to the state legislature and got them to preempt basically every tool that would involve sharing housing allocations and distributions, inclusionary zoning, all, sort of all the basic tools of that kind. So we are actually still quite challenged by that interaction. What's been really interesting in the past couple of years, and certainly this year in 2020, is there has been a lot more vocal organizing by people of color in formerly all white suburbs in the Portland region. I think about a place like Lake Oswego, which has been colloquially known as Lake No Negro for decades. Was having Black Lives Matter marches and people saying, hey, when you said you wouldn't allow any multifamily housing, like, that was racist. That was because of racism. When you didn't want the light rail expanded here and called it the crime train, that was racism. So it's coming in the conversation a lot more. And we continue to struggle through our regional governance to actually make that concrete and material. Even though we do have regional government, we don't really have a lot of regional cooperation when it comes to the idea of thinking about segregation and integration.
Maybe one last question here about working with, these would be homeowners who've lived there for a long time, in the neighborhood. Any kind of programs to specifically assist, not just, giving them a loan or a grant, but working with them to do their own repairs, kind of sweat equity kind of programs?
Yeah, there's actually a program, I'm like missing the name of it from my mind, but it's a program that kind of connects up. It's sort of like almost a Habitat for Humanity style model where it's like the homeowner is working on it, but there's also skilled people who come to support that, right, and matching people up to try to help them to do some repairs. I think one of the challenges now, 2020, is that folks who are longtime homeowners who need repairs, often at this point, those repairs go kind of beyond the DIY. And that's one of the ways that people end up kind of getting pushed into selling their house and having it flipped, is that the repairs become really significant. So we have been having a lot of conversation about how to support, the person who lives in like a 4-story, 4-square, right, old Portland home. And you can see they need a new roof, and then you can just imagine everything else that's going on inside. How do we support that more effectively, given limited dollars in capacity? And then again, make sure that, is there a will in place so that there isn't a probate disaster after, Meemaw passes away and there's 17 heirs and there's a legal fight and they lose the home. Like, how do we ensure that all of the pieces are in place that would support a family making beneficial decisions?
Well, let's see if there's any more questions. If not, we'll close it out. Anybody else have any last questions? If not,
I don't see any more in the chat.
Okay, neither do I. Lisa, thank you so much. It's fun hearing the name Ernie Bonner. He was one of my professors. It was the entire department. It was Ernie and Norm, I think, was the entire urban planning department. So it was great department. The small classes, we've learned a lot.
Yes.
So appreciate having you here. Interesting history. Geez, that some great archival research that you did, pulling those things together. I mean, that's terrific stuff. And I'm sure we have it here in Cleveland. It just requires one of our bright urban planning or urban studies students to do that kind of work and come up with it. So I'm sure it's all out there.
That's right. It's fun to get in there, get in the archive, and
it is.
You can get very angry at people from the past, but then also get very excited when you realize, hey, there have been people talking about greater justice and urban planning this whole time. Yeah. We just need to remember them too.
Well, much thanks. And folks who are on with us again, we're continuing our program, which starts